My boss is a jerk. We've all been there, right? Total jerk, doesn't appreciate you. Or how about that proverbial Karen in middle management that's just mean because she's mean? Companies, including your own, will rise or fall in line with how well the people, work, and organization goes. Getting this right can be a matter of literal life or death from your company or for your investment. But the surprising truth is, this can all be prevented if you know it works. So my next guest comes straight out of Google's founder project and is armed with the facts that you need to build a team that will dominate the market so that you too can enjoy your pursuit of making billions. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to another episode of Making Billions. I'm your host, Ryan Miller, and today I have my dear friend, Martin Gonzalez. Martin is the creator of Google's Effective Founders Project. It's a global research program that literally decodes the factors that enable startup founders to succeed. He also works with Google's engineering and research leaders on org design, leadership, and culture challenges. He's been a guest speaker at Stanford, Wharton, and INSEAD, and has advised across Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So what does this mean? Well, this means that Martin understands the literal science around building effective teams, organizations, and leaders, and he's about to teach you and I a masterclass on how to do the same so you can generate returns from your companies. So Martin, welcome to the show, man.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I've loved what you've done with this show, and I'm such a fan. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, well, awesome. We've had a wonderful show, and we're in 100 countries around the world, and it's all because of amazing guests just like you. So thank you for being a fan, and it's awesome to have you on the show. One of the things I find fascinating about you is how well-versed you are in the science, the data, and the statistics of what actually works. So folks, there's very little opinion. There might be a little bit, and that's okay, and I encourage it. But we're really going to get into the science of building teams, and this works if you're an emerging fund manager, a startup founder, or even a seasoned CEO. We all have different team dynamics, and as I like to say, people work is greater than paperwork. And so often it's important that just as much if you're a paperwork nerd like myself, who's a recovering CFO, we're all process and systems and designs and controls. Sure, great, fine. That's your job. But also, we do need to appreciate the undertones of working with people. If you build your business, you really want to build the people and the people build the business. That's an opinion of mine. You may disagree, but I really wanted to bring Martin onto the show to really showcase to our fans around the world some of the dynamics that come into. And in fact, you have some interesting findings that you would like to share today on really the surprising things that happen in companies, or should I say the surprising reasons why a lot of businesses fail. So let's jump right into that, Martin. Why do startups and other companies fail?
So there's this fascinating, very classic study now out of Harvard where they did a global survey of venture capitalists and asked, look at the companies in your portfolio that recently failed. What were the top reasons for that? And the number one reason by far, 65% of startups that failed because of the people issues. And then you have things like running out of cash, poor market timing, maybe a poor fit with the fund. And those are far second, third, fourth, fifth. And it flies in the face of, I guess, what is the common belief, right? Which is if you have the right product, have enough money, and hit the market at the right time, then you'll succeed. Unfortunately, that's not what the evidence shows. And that's been replicated through the years. And we see that this insight that the people issues are the number one reason for failure is unfortunately an enduring reason why companies fail.
Wow. And so people issues, and that can be you had the wrong founder, the wrong partner, the wrong hire. And that's usually where it starts. But sometimes it's the culture. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about hiring people and understanding culture, what your culture is and how you hire around that. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are maybe two really useful studies to talk through here. So there's this one study that was done out of some French economists. They looked at companies with good cultures and they looked at how that correlated with stock market returns. So they looked at what is the alpha that these companies will achieve across, their respective markets. They controlled for things like amount of funding flow, the kind of competitiveness, like they controlled for all these other factors to really get to, well, what is the real economic upside of a good culture? What they found was actually pretty nuanced and pretty interesting. Essentially what they find is when you look across 3 decades of data, and you look at those periods where we might call peacetime periods, so where economy is going really well, they find that the economic upside of these good cultures is fairly subtle. Where you see this really, the spike in the alpha of these companies is during the crisis period. So in the dot-com crash and the global financial crisis of 08, 09, like this is where you see a significant, alpha that you can achieve when you are kind of nurturing that. Now, what this tells you is if you're trying to build a culture in the middle of a crisis, you're way too late. You need to be building that during peacetime, so you can get through the wartime periods, while protecting the business.
So a good culture, it sounds like that in itself is an asset, and the value of that asset really starts to come forward during challenging times. Would you agree?
That's right. There's a really fascinating study that was done out of Stanford now a few years ago, where they tried to understand, so let's agree that culture is a good thing and there is economic upside, but which kind of culture actually works best? And so they did this study. It's a longitudinal study for nearly 300 companies. They followed them for about 8 years. They tried to understand, do they organize in different ways? Are there ways in which they maybe operate differently or think of hiring differently? They found these, what the researchers from Stanford called these 5 organizational blueprints. And, not to bore your audience, but basically it's things like, do they hire for this kind of extreme amount of potential talent? And, we can't afford experience, but we can afford like the top 1% of every graduating class. Let's hire that. Or, are people here because they feel like this is a family, as opposed to this is like a professional sports league? This feels more like a family. And so I find my community here. And so I hire for people who fit within that community. They look at things like, are the founders kind of more autocratic, more where they basically are the genius with 1,000 helpers kind of model, where, you have the person at the top who's basically generating all the decisions and ideas, how much bureaucracy they put in, how much trust they put in. There's kind of this guidance. So anyway, there's this plethora of ways they organize, and they found that there were really 5 key things. Now, maybe for the sake of our discussion, there were really 2 models that really stood out as probably worth our conversation here, right? So there was a model where you lean so much more on, do we have extremely brilliant people who can work on extremely hard missions? And maybe as a shorthand, we can call that like a performance culture. And then you have these companies that really optimize for fit. They want people who get the ideas, who get the culture. And so as you bring people in, and, some companies, the way they would do this is they would do hiring by committee, where, you have the candidate come in and, spend, a dinner with the group before you then decide to hire them. And you want to see how well they jive and fit with the culture, and they prioritize fit. Now, what they find from that study is pretty fascinating, that you could actually see fairly different financial outcomes from these 2 kinds of ways of organizing. What they find is that these performance-based organizations, where the goals are pretty difficult, they find that the likelihood of them failing, closing shop, going bankrupt is pretty high. It's part and parcel of this high risk, high reward, where you're really looking at, really difficult missions, and they're bound to, many of them are bound to fail. But if they do succeed and they go public, the chance of them actually returning a really great market, return is significantly higher than all the 4 other models that they studied. On the other hand, when you look at these fit-based cultures, because fit was all about, are you able to, do you basically operate on the same assumptions? Do you get each other? Can you finish each other's sentences almost? Somehow this becomes a really great execution machine, where you have a single idea, single vision, and they can really go far. And they find in this study that fit-based cultures actually has the lowest rate of failure and the highest rate of going public. But when they go public, here's the downside. When they go public, they're then unable to really reach the same kind of market returns that these performance-based cultures are. And it's at a point where you're diversifying the business, you're entering new markets, you want to tap new talent pools, you need broader networks. And this model, unfortunately, doesn't work as well at that stage. So I think it's just fascinating that there are many ways that you can think about how to organize, and you could optimize for different things.
Wow. So as the saying goes, begin with the end in mind. This is certainly one of those, and building your culture is no different. So if let me just synthesize what I think I just heard was, if you have a fit-based culture, meaning we're a family and people belong, and you're this leader who cares, and you're all into meditation, as I am, you may be tempted to build a culture that says, hey, when we're starting a company or a fund or whatever it is, still starting a company, you could build and hire people that get the culture, right? Basically, I see myself in you, therefore you must be good. And so you get these people that are a fit, and I'm doing air quotes for those of you listening to the audio program, the fit. And those tend to last the longest pre-IPO, but post-IPO, they tend not to create as much value. So if market domination is part of your thing, or making billions, you can still make billions, but if market domination and you want to lead your market, you want to be number one, right? You want to be Coke, not Pepsi. You want to be the head horse and the head honcho. You want to do that. Fit may not be the right culture to build. And so the flip side, and you keep me honest here, Martin, flip side is you hire for performance. You're like, look, I don't care if we get along. I mean, obviously you do. I'm being ridiculous, but we're saying the most important thing is not whether we see eye to eye or you're like me or I'm like you. The most important thing is you're really good at your job, whether it's HR or engineering or whatever it might be. I just want to hire the best people. And so then at IPO, so that's a little risky in the beginning, because you could have people issues, just people have different perspectives, leads to conflict. But in the long run, it can, if you pull it off, it can lead to, as I like to call it, market domination. All right, makes me sound cool.
You know, what's interesting about these, so the study calls them STAR, or the performance-based cultures. What's interesting in these environments, the way you attract these really brilliant people is you give them stock grants, you give them some kind of stock units. The double-edged sword of that is if the company does really well, then a lot of people will tend to want to cash out and leave, or won't need to work. And when the company doesn't do well, then they also will give up because it's not interesting to keep on going. So this performance-based culture tends to have higher employee turnover. But again, you cross that bridge to going public, like you know, the rewards are there for you.
Perfect. So then my question, my conclusion or thought or add-on question to that is, why not just build a hybrid? So for example, let's say you start as fit, right? So maybe I'm getting too greedy here. You got a smile on your face. So I feel like you already know how to answer this, but why not just build a hybrid? Meaning in the beginning, you hire for fit, right? So you mitigate those early things. You have the low risk model as fit. And then as you start approaching teenage to fully grown, mature company, you start packing in those people who fit. Now you pack underneath them more foundational people who are really good at their job, and the fit people at the top with the big tuna, the big CEO and the founder. And then the performance people are the worker bees are there. Why not create a hybrid over time?
Yeah. So let me tell you what the study says. And the study actually found, so first of all, if whether you pick fit or performance-based cultures, there are actually worse options for you. So building an autocratic or a very bureaucratic startup is actually worse option. So between the two of these are not bad options. But the study looked at, you know, when these companies shifted their DNA or their blueprint, like what would we see in terms of these metrics that they looked at? And that's actually the most detrimental choice you could make. Like by switching your DNA midstream, like you will actually see an increase in the turnover of your people who know how this business has been run. And you really truly risk, you know, what has made you successful up to that point. Now, if you're the caveat here, and this is how also social science research operates, if you're finding that you are already anyway going under, and we see this a lot, right? In my own personal practice in supporting leaders, when the business is really not doing well, don't stick to your guns. Like there's probably something wrong here. So you might have to really shift. I guess if it's a question of how do you go from good to great, the study is very clear. Be very cautious of that. To your specific example, like imagine that the inner circle of the CEO is kind of the ones reporting into the CEO, and then you bring in your strong, talented individuals under them. What you will likely see over the course of at least, a year or 2 years is you will see that these people who think of themselves as, brilliant people who think that they need to be in meritocratic environments, they will leave because they will see very clearly that promotions and the inner circle is not based on talent, but it's based on fit or based on kind of the trust, the loyalties. And that's not a terrible decision. Like I've been working recently actually with a company that really thinks of themselves as a family business, and it's part of their DNA to actually lean on people who are loyal to the family. Now, do you want to completely turn that into a Fortune 10 type performance-based environment? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that would be good for that business.
Brilliant. So don't mess with the DNA of your culture. It's pick one or the other, and not that one's bad and one's good. But just understand so number one, if you're the one building the company and the culture, understand what company culture are you building. Number two, if you're joining a company, it might be good to say, like you said, I'm used to a meritocracy. I'm an overperformer and I should get rewarded for my efforts. If I give you 110%, hopefully that shows you that I'm serious about this business and I'm going to win. And I want not only myself, but I want this whole company to be the best in the industry. And if you're in a fit business, they're going to be like, settle down, dude. Like, what, you're making us look bad. I've had that in companies before too. What do you say to that?
I would say that there's some fit-based organizations that are brilliant businesses. And so I think market dominance is not for everyone. Actually, I had a question for you. So it sounds like you've built several companies at this point. Like, surely you've played around a little bit with hiring for fit or hiring for performance. Like, what have you seen in your experience doing this?
So it's, that's a great question. And thank you for putting me on the hot seat. So, I'm split, and it is always a challenge for me because I have to temper my natural side where I was like, I really like this guy or I really like this girl. They seem really, really good. They're a good fit. Like, they would be, that's literally someone I actually would hang out with. Right? The beer test, right? Is this someone I'd actually go out for beers after work, whatever? And then I'm like, but can they deliver? Because at the end of the day, I didn't start this business to have a bunch of friends. And so there's this other side, the executive side is saying, but can they deliver on what it is you're actually hiring them to do? Because folks, if you're not a CEO, and many are, but if you're not, or you're close to that, you're really hiring to offset something either from you or from another leader. And so you're saying, can I actually trust that this person will get this project, get the budget, get the whatever over the line? Can they perform? Right? Do they have the talent, the skill, the tenacity, and all of these things? And so it is a constant internal battle when hiring for me is to say, this is someone that I would like to be around. In other words, they don't stress me out because I'm very big on energy. And one thing I've learned about talking to many billionaires on this show and outside of this show, and it's not even billionaires, people who are successful and whatever that means, they're very big on protecting their energy, their mental, their physical energy, all of that. And so that's a big one for me. Is this person going to add to my energy or the energy of the team or subtract from it? That's number one. Number two is, can they get the job done? And number three is, do they even want to get the job done? So is this just they applied because I'm one of 1,000? Or is this actually a job that fits into something they want in their goal, right? So is this someone who truly wants to be part of a winning team? Great. In finance? Great. But is this someone who maybe they minored in finance, but they're really an artist? Or something like that. And so it is a constant battle. I will be honest.
And the point on energy is a really good one because I think you could build a performance-based culture and still draw positive energy from. Like, you could build a culture where people are debating you constantly and still walk away feeling like, wow, that made me better. And that could give you a boost of energy. I think what we're saying here is, if you bring in, so what we're not saying in the performance culture is that you tolerate toxic behavior. That is something in the book that I've written, make it very clear that this is not about tolerating this aberrant genius who is brilliant, but then will kind of break things along the way. But it's, what do you prioritize? Do you prioritize this feeling of a family and this unconditional kind of we will? And there's a startup that we talk about in this book where they had a zero fire policy. What the downside of this culture is that they were hiring for an office manager, like someone who sits at the reception to then welcome guests. They interviewed 100 people or so before they could decide, because the moment you hire them, they would like not to break their policy, right, and fire them. So you could build that, but I don't know. I don't personally believe in going that far.
Yes. So even though it's performance based, it's not saying it's toxic based. We don't tolerate toxic behavior, no matter what that is, whether it's fit or performance. There still is undertones that you do need to play along. We all have plays to run, we'll say, as a team.
Yeah, part of my training as an applied org psychologist is, you need to come into a team and very instantly see, okay, is this a strong team? And the biggest tell of a strong team is the team that has a lot of conflict, but a conflict of ideas as opposed to a conflict of personalities. That is a team that's likely to succeed. So when you have a team where there is one person speaking and everyone's listening, taking notes, I question how strong that team is going to be in the long run.
Interesting. Speaking of teams, you've heard a lot of CEOs that talk about flattening their organization or a zero hierarchy organization. We're going to flatten it and it's too pyramid, and we need to, instead of a vertical, we need more of a horizontal, and there's too many layers of management. Sure. That can actually happen. I get it. I've been in big corporations where, they needed to right size. I understand that. Sure. But I'm curious, since you're so versed in the science and the data, talk a little bit about this trend that you're hearing CEOs, is it effective? Is it the right thing? Does it add value to a company or a fund or whatever it is? Maybe talk about flattening the hierarchy and the do's and don'ts of that.
So your audience will know that I come from tech, and tech has this unique love-hate relationship with managers. Like, this is just a part of this whole journey. Engineers basically don't. Engineers generally think that managers are from hell. In fact, there's a story early in the day at Google where our head of engineering thought, okay, let's repurpose our managers and just have them report directly into. So we had this VP of engineering and then something like 100 plus engineers reporting into them. Well, very quickly they found that this VP of engineering was spending way too much time approving expense reports and vacation leaves and resolving interpersonal conflicts. So at least for that, managers were useful. But I find that with CEOs in other industries, like these messages are fairly cyclical. When the economy is tight and you need to delayer or shrink the org, they will talk about how hierarchy is evil. When you're in a growth trajectory, you want really good managers because then that attracts the best people and keeps them there. And so these things cycle around. There's a really fascinating study that looked into gaming studios. So in the tech space, and I want to put the right framing around this. We're not talking about a 12-layer hierarchy here. We're talking about places that tend to actually either opt for zero hierarchy or one layer of managers. What they looked at is, I think, a few hundred gaming studios, and this was done out of Wharton. They tried to understand, there's a belief in the gaming environment that with managers, again, this love-hate relationship with managers, they will create silos that will then create these turfs and kingdoms that get built. And then therefore the flow of information across these kingdoms gets strained. And we therefore have maybe less cross-pollination of ideas and perhaps less creative games. So they wanted to put this idea to the test, right? And so they looked at these few hundred gaming studios. They understood if they added a layer of managers to this group, like how does that look like in terms of the creativity of the games? And they measured that through some really interesting text analysis of game reviews. And then they looked at, well, what does that also mean in terms of commercial outcomes? So how much these games were able to sell. What they found was that for every layer of managers you add, they saw a 1% dip in the creativity of these games. So yes, in some sense, to some degree, there is truth that these turfs, strain cross-pollination of ideas. But they found that for that 1% dip in creativity, you saw a 14% increase in commercial outcomes. So not a bad trade-off if you think about it. Now, you might say, look, it depends also on the life stage of the company, but really, I think the message here is this really popular idea that managers and hierarchy is evil really doesn't have a lot of evidence to back it up. Instead, what we want to say is think of bureaucracy and hierarchy in two different ways. These two are actually different things. We tend to conflate the two. And to be fair, they tend to grow in tandem. But when you have really healthy layer of managers, they actually reduce the level of ambiguity for the team, and you avoid chaos. No hierarchy could lead to chaos, which is something that we very quickly forget when we raise the fist to the bosses above us, right?
Yeah. So every layer in a hierarchy does create a 1% decrease in creativity, at least in this study. So there is somewhat of a downside, and that makes sense. In fact, it's more believable that way too. But then there's also a 14 times upside. So I mean, when we're investing, we're always looking for upside and downside, and can we get a disproportionate upside given the downside? So this is certainly one of them. So I think what I'm hearing then, you keep me honest, Martin, is hierarchy matters, leadership matters. Is that a fair summary?
It does. And I want to say healthy hierarchy, because I think you can have a managerial chain that, power trips doesn't do the work properly. One easy tell is to what extent do these managers actually connect one-on-one with their people? Like it's a very basic, it's like management 101. Unfortunately, it's not commonly done.
No, I recently went through that, and in my career, there was a company that had a lot of command and control style leaders that were over it, and it just decimated a lot of this group. And so these command and control, which we would argue is not really effective unless the building's on fire or something chaotic is happening, but often different leadership styles and healthy leadership styles do matter. And so can you connect with people? Do you build rapport? Do they trust you to talk about issues? Do they trust that you're not going to take credit for all the work? I don't know about you. We've had bosses like that. They're all out there, but having a hierarchy as a structure is not enough, I think we're hearing, but to fill that hierarchy with effective leaders, now we're really talking. So perfect. In a lot of companies, you'll see that every once in a while, there's disagreements between coworkers, between bosses, partners, whatever that is, and that can erode shareholder value. And I'm just curious, from your opinion, what have you seen as far as effective ways? Is that healthy? Because I know in your book, you talk about this of having dissension or disagreements. Talk a little bit about how to turn that into a very positive thing in a company that in essence helps shareholder value.
We spent a whole chapter in the book about this idea. And we start the chapter talking about how Peter Senge, who's this MIT professor who studied really how organizations really operate more like systems. He says the following, which really grabs me when I first hear it. He says, the collective intelligence of a team, of a leadership team, is often lower than the average intelligence of its individual members, which is maybe a fancy way to say you can be brilliant, you can have A players, but that won't guarantee you an A team. In fact, the likely tendency when people come together as a group is they tend to actually come out with less optimal outcomes. You tend to amplify each other's errors. You tend to turn the group into less intelligent. You diminish the intelligence of the group when you come together. And so we spent a whole chapter just talking about why it's so important to get this right. I mean, there's some really obvious things that many have talked about around how with a group that thinks very differently, that's not enough to then create an environment where you come up with really high quality decisions. You want to create the environment, the conditions where you can tap into those individual intelligences. There's a really fascinating story in this history books of computer science. There's a lab manager. His name is Bob Taylor. And Bob works in a company called Xerox Spark. So for your younger audiences, they probably wouldn't know of Xerox Spark. So you probably know of Xerox, which is this old school kind of, photocopying device. They actually built one of the most prolific innovation R&D hubs in the history of computer science, called Xerox Spark. It was located here in Palo Alto, near where I live. And this is where you get personal computing. This is where Apple basically sees what it's like to have a screen and a mouse. And this is where it all began. This is where you have the technology that powers Adobe, Pixar, 3Com. A lot of what we use today was invented in this place, right? And so Bob had a very good way of thinking about this. He said, it's not my role to solve disagreements. My role is to make sure I graduate every class 1 disagreement to a class 2 disagreement. What did he mean by that? So a class 1 disagreement is, Ryan, let's say you and I are debating about something. A class 1 disagreement is I refute your argument by creating a straw man argument, which is take your idea, represent it in the weakest way possible, and then making it easy for me to refute. He says, instead of that, come up with class 2 disagreements where you I will read back to you your argument in its best form possible, creating what some might call a strong man argument. And only then, when you're satisfied with how I've talked about your idea, then I can present my own. And he said it's not his role to resolve any of this. His role is simply to spot these class 1 disagreements and graduate them into class 2 disagreement.
Wow. So taking the role from straw man to strong man, typically it sounds like what you're doing is empathy may not be natural for everybody, and that's okay. Everyone has their strengths. But I think what it's saying is the ability, if you want to classify empathy as the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and take their position and perspective, is to say, hey, why don't you be an advocate for this agreement? And so let's say our manager, we're coworkers and we're bickering, and our leader comes in and says, okay, Ryan, I want you to take the perspective of Martin and really advocate for his position. And Martin, you take the perspective of Ryan. And so it's synthetically, you've set a policy or procedure, whatever it is, to move from class 1 to class 2, which is essentially just saying, hey, you know what would be really helpful is if you really considered their point as strongly as they do, both of us. And then from there, hopefully, the truth will emerge somewhere in between. Is that effectively what we're talking about as healthy disagreements and conflict in a company?
That's excellent. And I would go even further to say, empathy is not even required to do this well. If you can't muster empathy, look at this as a problem, like a puzzle to be solved. Take on the challenge of taking someone else's idea and drawing up an argument for it. Debate it out as if you're debating on their side. Make it an intellectual challenge, and maybe that helps people kind of do the work of coming up with class 2 disagreements. Because I agree with you. I think empathy. Look, like the reality is that if you hate the guts of the other person, it's really hard to really draw up enough empathy to do this well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fascinating standpoint on that is, yes, empathy can help, but really, I think, again, back to structure, this can be synthetically introduced into a lot of what we do. So I absolutely love that. Just moving on, I have another question for you. So, corporations, they have all kinds of employees and leaders and different mindsets. Maybe talk about what are some of those mindsets and how someone can go about working with them so that, again, we don't have these people issues that bring down companies.
Yeah. So, I work a lot with startup founders who think of themselves as disruptors in their industry, like mavericks. And they sometimes point that same energy and creativity towards the human condition in their, the human factors of their team, only to realize that there's some reasons why certain practices have endured. And so we actually dedicate a whole chapter talking about some of these myths that these founders bring to it. There's not enough time to go through everything, but I think there's some really worth calling out. So the first one that I think is worth, we talked a bit about the myth of scaling without hierarchy. So let's leave that since we talked through that. We talk about the myth of structural harmony, which is this tendency to want to think of an ideal culture or an idealized organization of one that's completely conflict free. And what you find actually is as you're building out the different structures of your team, or you have a finance team, an HR team, a sales team, a product team, etc., engineering, and you might even go further and have a hardware and a software arm. What you'll find is actually there is baked into the designs of these sub-organizations and their OKRs or their KPIs, you have inbuilt checks and balances that sometimes show up as conflict. And I think what many leaders make a mistake of is they conflate personal conflict with structural conflict. And those could be two very different things. Personal conflict could be about, agendas and personalities, whereas, structural conflict is about OKRs that are really meant. So an example of how this sometimes sounds like is software knows that they can always update the software every 2 weeks if they wanted to, but hardware, you can't launch and iterate hardware. You need to launch a really excellent product. Well, they don't see eye to eye on deadlines. Finance is going to always push HR to not overhire. HR will always say, finance, to get the right people, we need more budget. Sales and marketing will have the same spat. Oh, we didn't reach our numbers because, marketing, you didn't, awareness is down, or sales, you didn't get distribution up. So these things exist. Now, as a leader, you don't want to resolve all of this. You actually want to let that all play out because that brings out the best in the team. So that's one of them. The other one we talk about, which I really enjoy speaking to, is this myth of sustained heroics. A lot of founders themselves who own their companies, they are, their company is an extension of themselves. And so they work all hours every day, into the weekends, into holidays. And there's this belief that, heroics is what stood up this company by myself, by my co-founders. We should have a company based on this culture of heroics. And, a few things are problematic with that. So one obvious one is that if people wanted to be entrepreneurs, they probably wouldn't work for you. So if you're looking for the entrepreneurial spirit where people are willing to put in all the hours, you'll be hard pressed to find that. And so 50% of 100 people is much more than 100% of you. Other things are important to call out here too is when you have a culture of heroics, you have what some psychologists have begun to call this overperforming, underperforming dynamic, where the overperformer will be looked at over time by the team as someone who will save the day, someone who will put in the long hours, and ever so slightly, the underperformers begin to lean back a little bit more. They will underperform a little bit more because they know that there's someone who's going to save the day. On top of that, this overperformer will then grow resentment towards the team and start to see themselves as the hero. And so it creates this really sticky dynamic that's hard to break out of, where the hero swoops in constantly. Everyone else somehow feels like, the damsel in distress who's willing, who's ready to get saved. And that dynamic will play out if you begin with the premise that heroics is really important. So instead, what we ask leaders to do is to think about, how do you reduce these single points of failure in your company? These are your heroes. They are also your single points of failure. How do you create systems? How do you have a system where you're hiring really strong people who then can put in the right systems in place to make sure you're building an enduring company? And this is why, in many ways, this heroic founder will, most of the time, 90% of founder CEOs will not take their company public. Most companies that go public are going to be taken public by a professional CEO. And that's a big part of why these founder CEOs don't scale so fast, because they hold on to some of these beliefs, including this idea of sustained heroics.
Wow, brilliant. A big part of that, and this is a healthy activity, is developing an exceptional team. How do CEOs build an exceptional team that can handle the constant hustle and stress of the day-to-day? What would you say to that?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is make good decisions as early as possible. I think we spent a whole chapter talking about the trap of speed, where there is this systematic error that leaders, that we find CEOs fall into and founders fall into, where you're under extreme amounts of pressure to raise that next round of funding, to launch that product, to meet this customer's needs. And what happens is all those important things come into the foreground, and then all the other things that have more future benefits fall into the background. And usually that's things around, hiring well and not, and not hiring sloppy, or stemming a toxic culture, or letting go of that person who might be a really top performer, but is contributing very negatively to the culture. Those things tend to take a back seat. And our encouragement, first of all, is don't get sloppy on those things. Get ahead. And in the book, we actually outline 20 of what we think are those things that drag the team over time. If you don't get those right early on, they drag the team over time. The second one is, and this is partly the inspiration behind this book, is, we built this workshop that somehow received crazy rave reviews, that at some point it had reached founders in about 70 countries. And it's a workshop that we've now started to call the Bonfire Moment, which is also the name of the book. But the Bonfire Moment is a single day that we ask leadership teams to go through. It's a single day across the 365 days in a year, and perhaps the 5 years you will be together as a team, just one day. And in this day, we've structured the day to really get into discussing some of the elephants in the room, having some of those uncomfortable conversations that we usually leave for, when we can get to it. It's things like talking about, how will we operate when one of the team members is no longer scaling well, and what's an appropriate way that we can approach this, co-founder, this loyal friend, who built from, this company from the very beginning. Like, what's a good way to do that? What are some of the hard truths about how I'm leading that is really getting in the way of the performance of this team? There's a part of this workshop, which for me is the most endearing part of it, is what we call the bullshit circle. And in this part of the workshop, we invite people to reflect on how they bring a lot of the insecurities and self-doubt into the work, and how the masks we all wear sometimes create this toxic environment for folks. So all that to say, one, don't get sloppy on the people decisions. These are really important, and they will spell success and failure. And then two, go have a bonfire moment. Pick up our book. The book outlines everything you need to know to do this. And it could be, it could really help you along the way.
Brilliant. So as we wrap things up, I'm just curious, is there anything else you'd like to say? Closing remarks, ways people can reach out to you, the name of your book, where to get it, anything at all? Well,
first of all, thank you for having me, Ryan. It's been so fun to prep for this. It's been so fun knowing you, and I look forward to finally in person hanging out. So I'm active on LinkedIn. Please reach out there. The book, The Bonfire Moment, Bring Your Team Together to Solve the Hardest Problems Startups Face, co-authored with Josh Yellen. It's available in anywhere you can find books. Amazon's a good place too. Barnes & Noble, a few other places. And it's available globally too. So wherever you find yourself in the 100 countries your listeners find themselves in, you're bound to find the book. And yeah, reach out. I am always happy to connect. If you have questions, if you're working through some really sticky people problems. Part of the why I've loved this work, Ryan, is a lot of this work is about what happens behind closed doors. It's the things that CEOs who often find themselves feeling really lonely in some of these struggles, they have no one to really confide in and talk through. So if you want to talk, reach out and we'll chat.
All right, buddy. Well, I think you and I will always be texting each other here. So just to summarize everything that Martin and I spoke about, begin with the end in mind. Know if you're hiring people for fit or for performance, and stick with it. The second thing is, don't be afraid to build a company that has a hierarchy, but with one caveat is be sure to have effective managers within that hierarchy if you want to gain that 14% performance increase. Bad managers can just ruin all of that. The next one was just effective conflict that can be healthy for a company, just simply requires a culture of understanding perspectives. And so make sure that as you're building a company and you really want to build a valuable company, that you're building one with the people in mind that say, hey, if there's different perspectives, I need teams and people who have the ability to take that on and not just project their internal traumas or whatever it is that they're doing, but really understand, put that aside and say, hey, maybe I'm not seeing something. Help me understand your side. It's very effective. And that could really help unlock a lot of value in your company or the companies you're investing in. And then the next one is just be careful of being a hero. Think about your succession, that sometimes these hero founders or CEOs, sometimes they hesitate and they have this hero complex or whatever it might be. And often, according according to Martin and the data, is saying like that actually can hinder people at a certain point where they don't go public or they don't exit because of that. So just be careful and consider your succession and know when it's time to step out and hire a more professional manager. If that's you, ain't no shame in the game. You just get it done and move that vision forward. And then finally, to build an effective team, don't be in a rush to hire, but be in a rush to cut out toxic behavior. You do these things and you too will be well on your way in your pursuit of making billions.